Well, hey friends, thanks so much for joining us today from wherever you're watching from. We hope that what lies ahead is both helpful and encouraging for you as you discover more about what it means to trust in and follow Jesus. Now, just looking ahead, we got a few things I want to bring to your attention, but first I want to say thank you so much for everybody who swung by the church this past Friday evening for our drive-through supper in support of Kaya Shearer as she heads to Montreal later in April for a missions trip as part of Crandall's Claystone program, and we are praying for her that that trip will be beneficial and encouraging, not only for her and the team, but for those that they'll be ministering to. And so we ask that you continue to pray. But I want to say thank you so much to Bud and Suzanne, as well as Lori Goodwin, for preparing all the food for the chowder, the chili, the desserts, all the pieces that went into that, and as well to Brian Nickerson for donating all the lobster for the chowder. Thank you so much for your hard work and effort in support of this fundraiser for Kaya, as well to our teens and our students and all those who helped out in some way of serving and receiving the donations on your behalf in order to help support that trip. And so we just want to encourage you to pray for her and for the team as they head to Montreal later in the spring, and we'll keep you up to date on that as that time approaches. Now, a few things looking ahead to this week. First of all, we're going to be hosting midweek again here on Wednesday night at 6:30. We're going to be in 2 Timothy with the good fight. The devotion will also be available online as an option for you if you aren't able to make it here for Wednesday. And so we encourage you to just check that out online or join us, whichever is preferable for you during this season. As well, into the end of next week, I'm going to be taking some vacation time with my family. So about Thursday, Friday, we're going to be taking off for a week over March break, and just wanted to let you know that that's what's happening and that we'll be away during that time, which means that next Sunday, Pastor Mark is going to be preaching here at the church. Church online will still be available that you'll be able to watch there as well. And speaking of next weekend, next Saturday, don't forget, it's time to roll your clock ahead an hour. It's that time of year, even though there's so much snow that we're getting at the end of this week as we roll into the weekend. But the clock is moving ahead, so make sure that you know that. And speaking of next Sunday, one big thing, big change that I'll mention, because we're moving into phase 2 this week in the province of Nova Scotia. That means that we are moving to 75% capacity for Sunday services with as much social distancing as possible is the way that it's worded. And so here's what that means. While masks are still required for the next few weeks, we will not be doing pre-registration for Sunday services anymore. And we simply ask that as you show up, because there's no seating plan, that you just be courteous toward others, to give space and to be aware of that as you find a seat here for Sunday morning. Now, church will still be available online for the next little while in particular, so you can still take part in what we're doing that way, but we would love to see you here next Sunday at 10 o'clock.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. And here I am to worship. Here I am to bow down. Here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy. upon that cross. I'll never know how much it cost to see my sin upon that cross. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best Lord, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my life.
Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor men's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, be first in my heart. Thy King of heaven, my treasure thou art. Thy King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, oh bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Well, today we are wrapping up a major section of our teaching series, Everything Under the Sun. And just to kind of give you a heads up as to what's coming, over the next few weeks, we're going to take a break from the series as we lean into the Easter season. We're going to change gears, shift direction into something completely different as we head to that Easter celebration. And then after that, at some point, we'll probably pick up the rest of this series. There's about 4 more messages I think are going to be helpful for us that come out of this book. And so we'll get back to it eventually. But again, just to give you the heads up that the next few weeks we're moving to something completely different. Now, as I say that, today we're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And I want to encourage you, if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn there to follow along. I encourage you to do that because eventually we're going to get to the New Testament and we're going to tie together some other scriptures that I think will be helpful in pulling this theme together in our understanding of what the teacher is saying here in this book. Now, if you don't have a Bible, that's okay too. I'm going to read the key passages for us as we make our way through. But what I want to do as we start, just kind of lay out before us what we're dealing with today. And it's simply this. We're going to be talking about money and our relationship with it. Now, before you switch screens and pull up today's Wordle and start doing that as kind of you have the video playing in the background, or before you turn it off completely, just want to encourage you just for a second before you tune out, just hear me out, okay? Because I know that when people like me start talking about money, there's an anxiety that just increases in the room, right? Partly because you're not a financial advisor and I didn't even ask you for advice on it. So why are you talking to me about this? And what sometimes happens is there's this skepticism that grows. It's like, okay, this is all moving to the end. At some point, I need to write a check or I need to send an e-transfer, because the pastor needs a new sweater, or, we're doing this project over here as a church. And so where do I send the money, right? Just tell me now and let's get it over with. So let me just kind of hopefully help alleviate some of those fears by saying this. There's no pitch at the end, right? There's no please send us your money because we need it for something. That's not happening today, all right? So we're not going there. The other reason why I think conversations like this create a heightened sense of anxiety or stress is for a variety of reasons. One of them is that this conversation is typically a private one. Right? And when we drag the private conversation out into the public, it's something that we're not used to and get a little uncomfortable with. Now, the reason I say that is because, as we talk about private things, they're meant to be talked about in private. And talking about kind of financial issues and personal financial issues, those in many ways are appropriately private conversations. We don't usually walk up to someone and the first question we ask is, how much money do you make and what'd you spend on your new car? And, what's your financial investment practices and how much money do you have stored away? I mean, those aren't kind of public conversations. They tend to be more private. But attached to that conversation and our relationship with money is often emotion and sometimes stress, right? You think about the last conversation you had with your spouse about your household budget. For some of you, that conversation was an argument. For some of you, there were tears shed. For some of you, there were accusations about what you spent money on or didn't spend money on and all those things. For some of you, there's just the stress connected to money and finances because how will we pay the bills? We don't have enough income. That's overdue. I have all the data and I don't know how we're going to make it work. And for some of us, we get so stressed out we just say, I don't want anything to do with it. Here, you take care of it, right? And so just being aware that there's this anxiety, stress, because it's often a private conversation and we're pulling it out into the open. What I hope by the end of today and our time together is that this is going to be helpful for you as we think categorically about money and our relationship to it. Now, if you're thinking, haven't we already talked about this? In some ways, you're right. Back in chapter 2, in the beginning, we talked about the teacher's pursuit of meaning, purpose, and significance. And one of the places in which he pursued that was through pleasure and riches. But in chapter 2, the emphasis is more on pleasure and the pleasure that riches can afford. Whereas in this passage, it's more about riches themselves and the pursuit of money and gain and the love of it. And so that's kind of where we're headed. Now, we're going to jump right in verse 10 of chapter 5 with what I think is a controversial statement. And the reason why I say it's controversial is this, is when I read it, there's probably going to be some things that come to the surface for you about your reaction to what the teacher says. For some of us, you're going to hear it and go, yeah, that's right on. That's exactly true. That's always true. In fact, I can give you this example of an experience where that was so true. And I'm right now thinking of another Bible verse that actually backs backs it up and supports it and sounds eerily familiar. So yeah, let's get after it. Just let it out there. And then for some of us, as we hear it, there's going to be some things perhaps that rise to the surface that we kind of go, yeah, that might be categorically true, but there needs to be some more nuance. What about this over here? Or how do we think about that in light of this? Or here's how I interpret that phrase for myself. And so there's going to be a lot of dynamics at play. So just be aware of that as I read, starting in chapter 5, verse 10. Here's how the teacher puts it. He says, he who loves money. Now, again, I want to pause because this is a helpful and important phrase for us as we frame the conversation. What the teacher is saying is he's kind of giving a foundation to his argument or his observation about our relationship with money. And what he does is he doesn't simply say money that we manage. He talks about our love for money. He attaches a heart or desire to money itself. Now, for some of us, as we think about that, we just picture a greedy, miserly person who's just always trying to become wealthy, right? And doesn't care about anyone or anything else, right? And so we often think about very rich people who are outside of our stratosphere in terms of household budget. And this is who this is really targeting, is people who have excess, because it's clear that they love money because they've accumulated a lot of it. But the reality is that we all in some way or some time or another have desired to accumulate wealth, haven't we? And the reality is too, is that the love of money isn't just true for certain categories of people. For example, rich people. The love of money can be true for people who have much less as well. So whether rich or poor, we can love money. Whether you have $10 billion in your bank account that you're trying to protect and spend wisely and be stingy with, or that you might even spend in excess because that's how you love to use your money. Or whether you have $10 in your bank account that you're trying to protect and save for whatever it needs to be saved for, we can love money. And he says, and he addresses the conversation in terms of the love of money and what it can purchase and the amount we can have. So let's talk about that for a second, because when we talk about the amount of money, we're basically talking about our bank balance, right? Or how much you got stuffed in your mattress, or whatever your savings account is, how much you've got stored away for that rainy day or that thing you're saving up for. It could be your investments and how well they're performing in your tax-free account and all those kinds of things. There are savings and the amount of money we're trying to accumulate for whatever purpose, but then there's also the things that money can purchase. And we talk about the consuming of goods and services and, of kind of experiences that we can have. And so we purchase things, we buy groceries, we purchase services, we have somebody cut our hair, serve us a meal at a restaurant, cut our lawn, clean our house, and then there's experiences. We pay to go on vacations and to travel places. And so there's the amount of money as well as the things that money can purchase. And we kind of ran into this in our house the other day. I have this piggy bank at home that's a Darth Vader piggy bank. And, lately in the last few years, I guess I would say, or I guess I've always had to have it, but when I would spend cash in town and I come home with a pocket full of change, that change just kind of gets thrown into the piggy bank. And so eventually that piggy bank gets heavy and nearing full, and we need to do something with the coins. And so this past weekend, I decided, let's pull it down, we'll count it all up so I can stuff it away somewhere. And so we counted all this change. Well, when I was doing it, the kids wanted to get involved because they love to separate toonies and loonies and quarters and all the rest. And so we did that. Now for me, what was going on is that, the piggy bank felt full. I was curious how much money was in there, and now I'm going to stuff it away in this savings account that we have for this family piggy bank that we have that's, we just have been watching grow, and someday we'll probably spend it on something. So for me, it was about the accumulation. It was about kind of being curious as to what's there and just kind of moving it from one place to another. Well, that whole thing that happened, our kids then decided, well, hey, I want to count my money too. So they both came out with their piggy banks and they wanted to count their money. And so we did that just to see how much they had. But then for my kids, the conversation quickly turned to what can I spend it on? In fact, as many of you know, my kids are very much into Super Mario right now, and they have some of these Yoshi stuffies, and Emma's starting to add up how much money she has, and she says, Dad, Yoshis are only $20 each, and so here's how many I can buy. We need to get more. And I'm looking at her going, we are not spending that much money on a few stuffies, when you've been saving this for a long time. So we had to have a conversation about what's an appropriate use of money. But we talk about amounts of money and the ability of that money to purchase things. And that's our relationship with money. But here's what the teacher says in verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. And so he says, look, we will never be satisfied with how much we make or how much we accumulate. It will never be enough. In essence, he says the income that we have, we will always want just a little bit more. In fact, if you were to do a poll of people, no matter what their income levels, and say, well, how much more, if you just had a little bit more or a lot more, how much more do you think you would need to kind of get ahead a little bit? And most people will probably say somewhere around 10% more. That would just help me get ahead of the curve. It would help me deal with the things and the issues, and I'd just be a little more comfortable. And so no matter what stage, it's always just that little bit more. And his thing is, and his main observation is that whoever loves money will never be satisfied with it. It will never be enough. It will be a salary of smoke. That when you go to grab it thinking you've got enough wealth, it evaporates through your fingers. And he says, this is vanity, because we think we'll achieve a certain level or status, but when we get there, we find that it lacks the purpose, the desire, the fulfillment we thought that it would provide. And for some of us, we would say things like, look, when it comes to my income, they don't pay me enough to do this. Or maybe you've even said something like, there's not enough money in the world you could give me to do this, right? And so our relationship with money and the accumulation of thereof for whatever the purpose is a complicated one. And Solomon's main point, the teacher's main point right out of the gate is if we love money, we will never be satisfied with the amount that we have. He goes on to say this in verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats a little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will never let him sleep. In other words, as goods increase, as there's more options of things to buy or do, there's a bigger appetite that grows in us, which costs more money to be able to afford, which fuels this cycle of never having enough. In the same way that as we accumulate much, we have trouble sleeping. Why? Because it becomes a worry for us. It becomes this unsatisfying quest in our lives. And so it's fascinating that economists and psychologists have been working together for a few decades now to try to measure this relationship between money and happiness. And we've probably all said at one time or another that money can't buy happiness. And there's a part of that that's absolutely true. Money can't buy happiness. But a study in 2015 found something interesting about that. One of the consistent themes that came out of this study was simply this, that surprise, we are never satisfied with the amount of money we have. We will always want more. And so people from all kinds of incomes in a wide range all said, I'm just not quite satisfied with how much I have. Now here's what the conclusion of the study from 2015 was. Two things in particular. One is that money is actually a contributing factor to overall happiness. There is an amount of money that is able to buy a certain level, or at least contribute to a certain measure of happiness in our lives. And so one of the things that they found is that when our basic needs are met, that we tend to be more happy and satisfied in life, which makes perfect sense. But in order to be able to have those basic needs met, we need to have enough money to meet those needs. And so what they discovered is, for example, someone who earns earns $20,000 a year and someone who earns $50,000 a year, there's a gap between how happy they would say that they are in their lives as it relates to money and wealth. And so if you made $50,000 more, $50,000 a year, what they discovered is that you are 2 times more likely to be happier than the person who makes $20,000 a year. And again, it comes back to this idea of having our basic needs provided for. Because when that happens, there's less stress about money and how will we pay the bills. There's less fear about what if something breaks or goes wrong or we get in an accident, how will we ever be able to afford this, right? There's less pressure about, being able to do the kinds of things that other people are doing. And so there's a certain amount of happiness that money contributes to this kind of the overall happiness that we feel. Now, what they also discovered, though, in this study is that there's a certain point at which happiness does not grow at the same rate as income grows. And so what they discovered and the number they use, and again, this is dependent on kind of where you live and, kind of the economic system that you're a part of right now. And so there's a lot of room and flexibility in this, but on average, it was about $75,000 a year. And they say now that's about $90,000 a year. And so what they said is that, or what they discovered is after this, that the amount of happiness that people correlate to their income actually does not increase at the same rate. The difference is negligible. So if you earn more money, it doesn't actually make you all that much more happy. It is actually income and wealth are less effective at bringing you happiness or less effective at being a contributing factor to your happiness. Now, there's a study in 2021 that actually gave some conflicting results to this. In fact, that study said that the more that you accumulate, it tends to be that there is an increase in the happiness factor. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why that is the case, and one of them is that the goal of people of being happy is that their happiness was contingent on making more, and so that kind of explains some of the data. But the big picture and the idea of it is this: that there is a point at which money helps, but there's also a point at which money does not solve the issues. And what was true for all of it, no matter where it was again, the same thing. We are never fully satisfied with the money we have. Now, Forrest Gump said that there's only so much money a man needs. The rest is just for showing off. Now, the reasons why these kinds of things were true about the stress and the worry and the anxiety that comes in our relationship with money, again, out of this study, is why earning more didn't help in the end. The first part of it was this: that we tend to overestimate the amount of pleasure that we will receive from having more. And so we kind of project this ideal of our life of, if I was making this income, I would be so much happier. But if we ever got there, what we discover is that it didn't actually fulfill that desire in the way that we thought it would. The second thing is that more money actually, in many cases, leads to more stress. There's more you have to manage. There's more people asking for your money. And so there is this increased stress of different kinds of responsibilities that come with managing more money. And then thirdly, one of the reasons why, we tend to be unhappy is because we are driven by an endless comparison to our neighbors. Envy. Keeping up with what everybody else has and is doing. Now, that sounds eerily familiar because we talked about that just a couple weeks ago in relationship to career and work. That we see in human relationships how envy drives us sometimes to compete with our neighbor, and it's not helpful. And it's amazing, or it shouldn't be amazing, that these kinds of studies are just simply outlining what the teacher has already said. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. There's a guy named H.L. Mencken, and he said this, that the happy man is the one who earns $100 more than his wife's sister's husband. And so there's a sense in which, again, this idea of envy and greed and desiring to keep up with our neighbors kind of fuels this desire for us, but then we end up trying to love money, but it's never really satisfying. The teacher goes on to say this: there is a grievous evil, verse 13, that I have seen under the sun. riches were kept by their owner to his hurt. In other words, he put in the hard work and he worked really hard at protecting his investments and at gaining things, and maybe even to the detriment of some of the relationships with people around him. It says, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. And he came from his mother's womb. He shall go again naked as he came. He shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away with his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and in anger. In other words, there's a man who worked really hard to accumulate much. And this is, again, a bit of a parable of sorts, but in a bad venture, a business deal gone wrong, or maybe the market crashed, or whatever happened, he lost it all. And he dies poor. And he can't even give anything to his family or leave it for them when he's gone. And the rest of his life he spends in poverty and sickness and in just turmoil because of what he has lost. Now, this line of thinking continues again in chapter 6 in the first couple verses. Teacher says, there's an evil I've seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This too is a vanity. It is a grievous evil. In other words, there's misfortune and disaster that comes. There's a heaviness of heart to it when you earn something only to not be able to enjoy it. And again, the reasons could be plenty. Maybe because out of envy, it's sucked the life out of the joy you have in your work, or maybe you've lost it financially to someone else who takes it from you, or maybe you're just realizing that at the end of the day, it's going to be left to someone else. Whatever the reason, there's this misfortune that happens, and we've set this guy in particular sets his goal and his desire on wealth, but what he discovers is that even in gaining much, he can't even enjoy it. Now, in the middle of all of this conversation, there's kind of this stunted conclusion. There's this piece that is a bit of a moment of reflection that the teacher offers in light of all these things. And so in chapter 5, verse 18, he says, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in the toil for which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Now, his advice is to simply enjoy life, no matter what stage of life you are in. So it's not that we should hate money or misuse or mismanage money. No, we should manage it well, but let's not hate it. Like, that's not the conclusion we should draw either. He actually says to enjoy life. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in this toil, this too is the gift from God. And so he's saying, look, no matter where you're at, he says, don't live out of envy of people who have more, because ultimately that will be to your destruction. And so enjoy the life and the position that you're in, that God has given you and allowed you to have. He says, for he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. In other words, there will be contentment. True contentment comes when we can enjoy life without being preoccupied with wealth and with our financial state of being. In other words, the love of money doesn't provide for us lasting contentment. Now, you may say, well, listen, that sounds actually all too familiar. And you'd be right. Because if you're thinking of 1 Timothy chapter 6, the Apostle Paul again says something very similar. He says in verse 10, for the love of money. There's our phrase again. It's not money itself, it's the desire for money, right? Money is an object that makes a terrible master, but a great servant. He says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. Now, this verse has been misused and misquoted and misapplied in so many ways, but here's what he's getting at. He says, the desire for money and our love of money and making it a master and not a servant, and putting it in a place where it becomes a god or an idol or something that is all-consuming for us in our lives. That love of money is a root of all kinds of evil things. In other words, it is one of the base desires that pushes or motivates us to do all kinds of terrible things. And so when money becomes our God, we get way off the rails and we end up in places that we never would have wanted to end up in. In fact, this shouldn't surprise us that Jesus actually says something similar as well in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other." In other words, if you felt that tension before in your life of trying to please two people that want two different things or that constantly demand your allegiance, if you've had one friend that says, if you ever hang out with that friend, we're not friends anymore, like, you know exactly what this is about, right? You can't, serve two people equally, because you will have a greater love for one and you'll despise the other. The relationship gets really, really muddy. And Jesus concludes by saying, you cannot serve both God and money. You can't do it. It is not possible. There will be a conflict of interest and a desire within your heart. He goes on to say then, so how do we live in light of that? Because we need money to live. We need money to survive. There's things about our life that we get anxious about. And Jesus simply says, don't be anxious about your life and what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink and what you're going to wear. Again, let's just not pay attention and mismanage everything. But here's what he does say in verse 33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Put God first. Seek God's desires first. Seek God's kingdom first. Make him the object of your desire, that his values for your life and the kind of person that you will become and what you put your heart into. If you do that, all these things will be added unto you. You will find yourself in a place, in a posture that trusts God for the lesser things when you put him first. Now again, in another place, in Luke chapter 9, again, this comes more as a warning, or it's a harsher statement, we might say, from Jesus. But he says this in chapter 9, verse 25. He says, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to your life?" Sorry, that's not the right verse. That's chapter 12. In Luke chapter 9, verse 24, although that applies too. In Luke chapter 9, verse 25, Jesus says, "For what does it profit a person if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself?" In other words, what advantage is it to you if you're there building your own kingdom, in the end only to have it completely destroyed or you removed as king? What advantage is it going to be to you if you just spend your whole life accumulating and amassing and building and gaining and in the process lose who you are, and in the end lose your very soul? In fact, a little bit later on, now in Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable or a story that comes out of a question. And in verse 13 of chapter 12, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, what's going on is that for this guy, his parents are either going to die or are dying, and this inheritance is being left to him. And for some reason, his sibling, his brother, is getting more than him out of the inheritance. Whether truly he is or in his own eyes, there's something that's inequitable about it in his view. And so he simply says to Jesus, "Jesus, I want you to take my side. I want you to kind of come in and fight for my cause. I want you to get on board with what I'm about here and say to my brother, this isn't fair. And I want you to come in with some authority and kind of speak into the situation and make him do for me what only seems right to me." And Jesus says to the man, "Who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" In other words, Jesus says, look, I'm not in that place to do that. Why are you coming to me and asking me to kind of step into this matter and to meddle into something that's not my matter to meddle into? Why are you asking me to fight for your cause in something that then really there might be something else going on here? And so Jesus just simply says, look, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. And you've probably had that happen in your life too, where people are saying, hey, can you come in here and fight this cause for me? Can you kind of join my side and lend your voice? And would you just kind of speak out against these things that I'm so passionate about? And in this moment, Jesus says, look, we need to pay attention to some other things. There's something bigger happening here that we need to focus on. And Jesus says, I'm not getting sucked into that argument. He says to the guy, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Now that's offensive, isn't it? Isn't the guy going to be kind of pulled back and say, how dare you say that? What are you talking about, covetousness? No, I'm asking you to fight for my cause and just do so I'm treated equally as my brother. And Jesus says, oh, you need to be careful about covetousness. Now, covetousness is simply a desire for what someone else has. It often motivates us to all kinds of different actions, but Jesus kind of pulls back the layers and says, hey, let's think about what's actually going on in your heart right now, because that's an important thing. In fact, covetousness is sin. And it's something that ought not to be characteristic of God's people. And he simply says to the man, hey, you need to guard against that. That can't be true of you. Why? Because your life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions. In other words, life isn't measured by stuff and spreadsheets. He goes on to say this. He says, and he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. Now, this is a good problem. If you're in business, like, this is a great problem to have. We just don't know what to do with all that's happening and all the good that's come out of our efforts in our work. Like, how do we manage this? And so it's a good problem to have. And so the man says, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Man, so what does he do? He simply looks at the situation and says, I'll build it bigger, I'll store more, and now I can put my feet up. I've done the hard work. I'm just going to enjoy life. And that's very much the vision of the good life that is sold to us. If we just don't have to work anymore, we can finally do the things we want to do. We can eat the food we want to eat. We can go to the restaurants we want to go to. We can travel the world. We can simply enjoy life and not deal with the worries and stresses and pressures that come with it. And then Jesus says this, but God said to this man, you fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? In other words, your time is up. The game is over. So, Jesus says, is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You know, the great tragedy of this story is not even really that the man lost his wealth. It's not so much that the man even died, perhaps too early or earlier than expected. The great tragedy of this parable is that the man missed out on what is truly life. And so what do we do with all this? How do we deal with this relationship that we have with our money? And I'd sum it up in this way for us, that instead of getting rich, we should be rich. Instead of getting rich, be rich. And so, in fact, this is exactly what the Apostle Paul says later on in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He's already said in verse 10, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And so how do we deal with that? Well, he says in verse 17, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, that is to consider themselves better than everyone else, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, because it's a salary of smoke, it's a vapor and a mist that just kind of disappears through our hands. It gets burnt up quickly. It's we think that we grab some substance to it, and it's just not as dependable as we think or hope it will be. He says, don't set your hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Let's just recognize for a moment that every good thing comes from God's hand. And he says, here's what they are to do. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. In other words, don't let your pursuit of wealth trick you into thinking that you are no longer dependent on God for anything. Because that's one of the great temptations that come with wealth. That we find ourselves in a place that we think that we're sustainable, that it can't really be taken away from us. We're all set, but in a moment it can disappear. And really, at the end of the day, if we don't steward it wisely, we've missed out on what is truly life, of having treasure in heaven, of investing in something of eternal value. And so Paul's encouragement to Timothy to tell people who may be consumed with the love of money, or at least have money, or who are trying to manage their money well, not just to do good, but to be rich in good works. Not by gaining and accumulating, but through generosity and giving. And when we begin to develop that relationship with our money, we too will take hold of what is truly life.